So let's say it's a Monday morning after a weekend in the office, and there are hundreds of emails. You are expected to give certain reports in short time, say in a day or so. As you are concentrating on what to do as a priority, there are phone calls giving you new information, which either you want or you don't want. And then there are some other people waiting for you, and they are expecting you to take some decisions. So under such situation, how to apply non-doership, because you are expected to take certain decisions, you are expected to finish some work within given time, and you feel time pressure, and you feel as if you are going to step on a treadmill which is running at a very high speed, and you just are expected to cope up with that. So what kind of attitude which you can adopt, and how can you apply the principles which you have just talked about, so that you still have that underlying peace and peace of mind?
Yes. I mean, one thing is that we have to realize is because someone else has an expectation, or because we have an expectation, doesn't mean that that's how life is going to turn out. The fact that your boss has an expectation that you can do 50 things doesn't mean that you're actually going to be able to do 50 things. So if you sign an agreement between you and someone to a contract for something in the future, that is essentially a concept that you and the other person have about how life in the future will look. Right? But life in the future may not have anything to do with how you and the other person have agreed it will look. So we take our concept about how life should look and the concept of the other and say, okay, well, we've agreed on it, so now this is how it has to turn out. And so if someone breaches the contract, we look at them and say, you've breached the contract. Whereas actually another way of looking at it is life has turned out the way it was destined to turn out. And in the story of life, it was destined for a contract to be put in place that says, hey, you and I think life should turn out this way. And in practice, life turns out according to how life is going to turn out, which could be very different. So going back to this, just because your boss has an expectation doesn't mean that that's what God has in mind. So we sometimes need to align with a more accurate relationship to life, rather than just believing what society is telling me how life should look. Now, this could be problematic. We say, well, if I do this, I'm going to lose my job. And if I lose my job, I won't be able to look after my family. So there is that consideration. But if you find that your attitude of buying into what your boss is saying has to happen, which may not be possible, is now creating your absence of peace of mind, and you've decided what your priority in life is, then it might no longer make sense for you to carry on that story. You might need to start making changes. So it depends on whether your priority is my happiness, my completeness is dependent on outcomes, or whether your priority is my completeness is not dependent on outcomes, my completeness is dependent on peace of mind. So if that becomes your priority, then you say, well, actually, I don't need to deliver what my boss says I need to deliver, because delivering what my boss says I need to deliver is essentially my way of getting the outcome that I feel is essential for my completeness. Now, this is a very big step to take. It requires a big leap of faith. It requires us to become very clear on what our real objective in life is. Is it outcomes, or is it peace of mind? What I found is that when the uncomfortableness that was arising when I was functioning in life a certain way became strong enough, there was enough motivation to make change, even if the change had certain negative consequences attached to it. And also, to my surprise, is that when life delivered that mix that made it possible for certain changes to happen, even when there were negative consequences attached to it, I made the changes, and to my surprise, the consequences didn't turn out the way I expected. So, in my nature, I would say to my boss, look, the only way I can carry on working in this environment is if these become my new objectives or my new measurables. Because under the current system, I can't keep delivering. That's not going to be acceptable to some people because the consequence is too significant. I didn't have a wife and children, so my circumstance was different. Maybe in the case of someone with a particular circumstance, it just isn't possible for them to take that risk. That's destiny.
But is this running away from the situation? Or can you be more peaceful and still do the work, whatever is required to be done? So the main question is how not to feel the time pressure.
Well, you can't not feel time pressure if time pressure is there. So your question is actually very good. Is it possible to be at peace even in that circumstance? And the answer is yes, because our happiness is not to be found based on circumstance, but rather our attitude to circumstance. However, what I've found is that, and this isn't something I say often, and it's very important because in a way, it's a nuance to what I normally say, which is your happiness isn't to be found in circumstance, but rather your attitude to circumstance. However, that doesn't necessarily apply if your circumstance that you're in is heavily supported by the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. If your circumstance was put in place essentially because of doership and attachment to outcome, then I feel that circumstance needs to change. If, however, the doership and attachment to outcome is not part of the circumstance, then the peace can be there because we realize that the outcome is part of life unfolding, destiny, God's will. My capacity is part of life's will and destiny, and the circumstance I find myself part of life's will, destiny. Which means in each moment, do exactly what you can do, and then leave the outcome up to God. That means that if you find that you work less quickly, and then you get fired from your job, the attitude needs to be not, that was terrible advice from Roger, I hate him. It needs to not be, oh, I'm such a failure, I should have been able to work harder, but rather an attitude that sees everything that happened as part of life. This is the outcome, and now you move on from there. What will happen next is you will look for new jobs, and hopefully you'll get one that might be even better.